This is the third video in a series showing how to install, configure, test, and debug the MVS Toolkit. In this video, we'll cover how to use the Toolkit Client IDE to configure web service providers and multi-value servers. One warning about the Toolkit IDE before we continue. It is possible to install multiple instances of the IDE, all pointing to a single instance of the Toolkit server. In a case like this, it's important for the users to understand that there is no real locking mechanism preventing multiple users from updating the same thing at the same time. So please make sure users are aware of this so they don't step on each other's work. Let's take a look at the Toolkit IDE client. Launch the IDE. First, collapse the welcome page if it is presented. Next, collapse the lower right-hand panel. You'll get more room when doing other things like defining, editing, and testing web services. The upper left panel is where you'll find your web service providers, web services, web service operations and resources, and dynamic array definitions. The lower left panel is where you'll find your D3 and MV-based servers. Let's start by defining the web service provider. In the Toolkit IDE client, in the upper left panel, right-click MV Web Service Providers and click Create Web Service Provider. A dialog will pop up asking for the server name, user ID, password, host name, and host port. Make sure you don't touch the user ID and password, as changing this was never fully implemented, so that you know the user is admin and the password is mv.admin, both all lowercase. The default for server name is local server. I recommend something more descriptive, like your host name with _MVS appended. This will make it easier to tell the difference between a web service provider and an MV server. Hard to do if they're both called local server. For the host name, you can use an IPv4 address or a name that will resolve to an IPv4 address. Leave the host port at 3410 unless you have a specific reason to change it. This is the TCP port on which the Toolkit server listens for this IDE client. Click Finish. You'll now see your web service provider listed under MV Web Service Providers in the upper left pane. To connect to the web service provider, right-click on it and click Connect. Once connected, you can now define, edit, and test web services once you have an MV server defined. So let's do that now. Please note that setting up an MV-based server is not that much different from setting up a D3 server, so we'll use D3 in this example. Since the toolkit talks to D3 via MVSP, you'll need to make sure you have MVSP configured and running and have a D3 user set up for use with the toolkit. This is all covered in the MVSP configuration video series. If you don't already know how to do this and have not yet watched that video series, please do that now. If you've already got MVSP running, it's time to define the MV server. In the lower left panel, right-click MV Servers and click Create MV Server Connection. A dialog will pop up asking for the server name, user ID, password, host name, host port, and a database dropdown. The default for server name is local server, just like in the web service provider dialog. Again, I recommend something more descriptive, like your host name with a _D3 appended for the same reason we renamed the web service provider's server name. Use the user and ID and password you created when you set up MVSP. For the host name, you can use an IPv4 address or a name that will resolve to an IPv4 address. Leave the host port at 9000 unless you have a specific reason to change it. This is the TCP port on which MVSP is listening for requests from the web service provider and IDE client. If you're using MV-base, change the database dropdown accordingly. Click the Test Connection button to make sure the MVSP connection can be made and click OK when it's successful. If it's not successful, go debug MVSP and figure out why. Click Finish. You'll now see your MV server listed under MV Servers in the lower left pane. To connect to the MV server, right-click on it and click Connect. In the next video, we'll talk about creating web services, web service operations, and web service resources. If you have any questions about any of the content we've covered so far, please contact Rocket D3 Support.